Good evening, everyone. Andrew here again with another update on Hurricane Dorian. We have another day of this storm and not much movement at all. It's just been creeping around the northwestern area of the Bahamas, specifically Grand Bahama, and it is now west of Abaco Island. So the worst of the storm is over for them. But as they're now trying to recover and kind of deal with what Hurricane Dorian brought to those islands yesterday, it has now just been lingering around Grand Bahama for pretty much 24 hours now. Last night, when most of us were going to bed, it was just south of the eastern portion of Grand Bahama, and it is now finally crossed over the island, but now looks to be beginning to kind of creep back south a little bit. So it's just lingering around here. The National Hurricane Center advisory, the latest one that was issued just at 9 p.m. just a few moments ago, has it listed as stationary. So as you can see, not much happening here with Dorian. A worst case scenario for the Bahamas here, because as they are trying to realize and actualize the actual damage that the storm has caused, not able to get out and actually start recovering or even evaluate the damage, just because there are still very intense winds and thunderstorms. Dorian has begun to redevelop some of these darker colors, indicating higher cloud tops and more intense thunderstorm activity around its eye again, and just dealing the Bahamas a great blow here. So probably going to see some pretty horrendous images and hear some pretty dark things about a pretty grim scenario for the Bahamas. And we really want to hope for the best, but unfortunately, those islands have taken a huge blow here from Dorian in the past couple of days. And by tomorrow morning, Dorian will start to move away from Grand Bahama, and those areas can start to recover from the storm. But as for now, it still lingers around here, about 100 miles east of mainland Florida, and the current forecast track has not changed. Very little tweaks have been made from this time last night that I talked to you for about 24 hours ago. Not much change in the forecast. Still going to just get very close to the Florida coastline and then kind of trace the southeast coast up to North Carolina, where impacts are now very likely as the storm continues to move out to sea, and then it will move on and we can bid Dorian good riddance. Kurt says hello from West Palm Beach, Florida. Hi, hope you're doing well tonight. You're probably dealing with some, breezy conditions and maybe some couple passing showers. It really has not moved at all. It moved about 50 miles over the course, or about 30 miles over the past 24 hours, and maybe about 50 miles in the past 30 hours. So really not moving much. I'm just kind of lingering here. But by tomorrow morning, there is a trough that is coming down from the continental United States, and it's going to interact with Dorian, and it's going to start moving again. It's pretty amazing that we've been able to nail down that the storm was going to kind of stop on a dime like this before it turned. So a huge success for numerical weather prediction and forecasters there. Unfortunately, it happens to be over a populated island in the northern Bahamas. So that is the bad news, but the good news is that the storm is expected to begin moving away. And in the wee hours of the morning, overnight tonight into tomorrow, we'll start to see some movement on this hurricane again. Winds have been adjusted down to 140 miles per hour. There's no reason to use the word weaken here. It's still a major hurricane, still a very powerful storm, a monster storm that's still, wrapped up quite nicely. And this is certainly a concern because it's still anticipated to remain a major hurricane. This M indicating major hurricane, H indicating hurricane strength category 1 or 2. Major is category 3 or above. So still a category 4 storm with those 140 mile per hour winds. The minimum central pressure is down to or has risen a bit, indicating a bit of weakening in the storm itself. The central core of the storm up to 942 millibars. So the storm is holding its own, but it is beginning to encounter some elements that are causing it to degrade a little bit, which is certainly good news. We want a weaker storm. A weaker storm is going to be more susceptible to steering currents of the atmosphere, and hopefully it gets pushed out to sea with minimal impacts. But again, you're looking at the National Hurricane Center's official track here. You still see it coming very close to the Carolinas, and a lot of model guidance, which is used as a tool for forecasting, has it making a landfall either at our 3 points of North Carolina here in Wilmington, then you have Cape Lookout, then you have Cape Hatteras. One of those does look to be very close to the center of Dorian as it passes by North Carolina as a hurricane between Thursday and Friday of this week. So you still have time to prepare if you need to make preparations. It's a very Matthew-esque track in terms of who could feel the most impacts. I'm going to bring up a map in just a minute of the actual North Carolina impacts for the majority of the listeners who would be tuned into this video. But now's the time to make any preparations. Crank up your generator, take photos of your home if you think any trees are susceptible to falling from tropical storm force winds. Make sure if you have pets, make sure they're accounted for. Make sure you're prepared for a nasty day of weather. The latter half of Wednesday, Thursday, and the beginning of Friday, as this storm finally begins to turn out to sea and get out of our hair. And boy, we'll be glad when that storm is gone. So I wanted to jump over. This is the Coastal Emergency Risk Assessment page, SARA, which is a joint effort between Louisiana State University, LSU, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Homeland Security. A lot of entities work together to make this map. It has the official hurricane track overlaid here, and this is indicating storm surge. As you can see, last night we were talking about Dorian in this position. It was right about to enter onto the eastern part of Grand Bahama, which is this island here. And it dragged a little bit south, and then it finally jumped over the island and has just been lingering here, and it still is just lingering, and it's expected to begin to finally move off overnight tonight and into tomorrow morning, but it has just sat over the Bahamas, and it is just unprecedented in that there's never really been a storm that's just kind of parked itself for this long over the Bahamas. So it's kind of an uncharted territory for that. So we can kind of expect unprecedented impacts, and unfortunately we'll probably hear some horror stories out of the Bahamas over the next few days because they have endured a huge blow with this storm. So send your thoughts down to the Bahamas. But I digress. I was talking about the storm surge impacts from Dorian, and I feel like this is kind of flying on the radar right now. Not a lot is being talked about in terms of storm surge impacts from Dorian. The silver lining to the impacts here we'll feel in North Carolina and along the southeast coast is that Dorian is moving rather quickly, or it will be when it begins its curve back out to sea. It will be moving rather quickly, so it's going to come, it's going to deliver its impacts, and then it's going to get moving and move on. It's not going to be like a Florence where it lingers for several days. It's not going to be a Matthew that hangs around for 12 to 16 hours and gives areas several inches of rain. It's not going to be a slow moving system when it gets to North Carolina, so that is good news. But the storm is growing in size. So I want to go back to the satellite loop here for a second. We're looking at infrared satellite. We can't see the storm at night because the sun is on the opposite side of the earth. So the infrared satellite is showing us the colors which indicate the temperature of the cloud tops. The more vibrant the colors, the more vibrant and darker the colors, the cooler the cloud tops, meaning the more intense the thunderstorm activity. And last night, Dorian's eye was about 20 miles across in diameter, so it was something like that, and it actually underwent an eyeball replacement cycle early this morning, and it actually broadened its eye by about 150%, and I think its eye is between 35 and 40 miles wide now. And the storm has grown overall in size. If I were to loop this back farther, which I don't have these images loaded right now, so I'm not going to do that, but it has grown in size a little bit, which means the wind field has expanded. So whereas if we were going to have a storm, up here 70 miles off of the coast of Florida, and the wind field is something like this, with Dorian having all of that energy pent up inside of it, as it begins to weaken and finally starts to degrade as it moves up the southeast coast, it's going to encounter some cooler ocean temperatures. It's going to encounter some friction from the land, and it's going to begin to degrade. But when hurricanes this intense weaken, their wind field tends to expand greatly. Their eye will become more ragged, which you can already start to see that now. It's still a powerful Category 4 storm, but the eye is certainly degraded from its presentation yesterday. The wind field will expand, so even if the storm is out here, maybe now the winds, hurricane force winds are being felt in an area like that, and that will come into play as it comes into North Carolina. Just how big the system is will determine how far inland those impacts come in regard to hurricane or tropical storm force wind gust, potentially hurricane force wind gusts for the Tidewater area of North Carolina. And again, for those who are just now tuning in, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to pull up a graphic of produced by the National Weather Service, and I've kind of adapted for a different map that I'll show you in terms of what kind of impacts we'll be watching. So thanks for tuning in. Just giving another update on Dorian. I'm going to do one of these every night as long as I have power come Thursday or Friday. I live in the coastal plain of North Carolina. I live in Johnston County, so I'm in line to get some impacts as well. And we tend to have a very weak power grid where I live, so we will see if I make it through unscathed. But every night I do have electricity. I plan to do one of these update videos until we can bid good riddance to Dorian. So going back to here, if we move up the coast, still some storm surge impacts being felt. As the storm grows, there's going to be more storm surge pushed up against, and storm surge just refers to the sea basically being displaced by the storm. If you have your storm in this area, and you have the rotation of the storm counterclockwise, you have ocean water being pushed up against the shore, and then once the storm passes, you have water being evacuated from the shoreline. So everywhere ahead of Dorian is likely going to get a big wallop of storm surge, at least for several hours as the storm approaches, all the way up the east coast, which is kind of a unique setup, especially as the storm is growing in size and weakening. It's still going to have enough, it's going to pack enough of a punch to deliver some storm surge. And this particular model, storm surge, has more significant impacts once you get to coastal South Carolina, which the governor of South Carolina ordered a mandatory evacuation for all coastal South Carolinians who live in flood-prone areas, which I think equates to about 830,000 residents. And they actually initiated contraflow on Interstate 26 earlier today. So what that means is that instead of there being a eastbound and westbound lane, there's actually they have the state troopers kind of line up on the interstate and flush all of the traffic, and they had both lanes of Interstate 26 going inland to maximize the efficiency of evacuating from the coast. It's a very surreal kind of thing to see, and usually only occurs when we have these mass evacuations like with hurricanes. So preparations are underway in South Carolina for a dangerous storm. We can expect the same here in eastern North Carolina, and still expecting some major storm surge impacts from Dorian. I'm still kind of, this model is based on data that's being put through models. I don't really know where they source their data from here on this tool, but as Dorian gets a little bit larger and comes up the coast, still could have some major impacts all the way from Charleston up to Myrtle Beach up to Wilmington, and then again these 3 points of North Carolina: Wilmington, Cape Lookout, and then Cape Hatteras, all potential to have some major storm surge impacts. Of course, we saw these colors as well with Florence last September. So we're coming up on the year anniversary of Florence and already dealing with another hurricane. So it's still pretty raw for the folks down here in southeastern North Carolina that were dealt the biggest blow with Florence. But still some potentially dire impacts in regard to storm surge and coastal flooding and saltwater inundation from the storm. So that's kind of been flying under the radar. We're really focused on the rain and wind, but I haven't heard a lot of chatter about the storm surge. I know UNCW, University of North Carolina at Wilmington, is ordering, or classes are canceled for the remainder of the week starting tomorrow, I believe at 5 p.m. Don't quote me on that, but I know that they are taking preparations to evacuate students as well. I know Ocracoke Island down here is under a mandatory evacuation beginning, I believe, Wednesday at 5 a.m. if I'm not mistaken. I plan to compile a list of those and list those as well. Of course, if you're in the area, you likely know if you're being evacuated or not. I don't think I have many people on this page from those areas, but certainly good to know that preparations are underway for a dangerous storm as it approaches. So the storm surge threat is something we'll have to monitor and see. These are very likely to change as Dorian continues to ride up the coast and show that how large the storm is, what kind of impacts we'll have for the storm surge. In regard to the radar, the eye has expanded, as I mentioned earlier. It went through an eye wall replacement cycle. The eye kind of expanded, the wind field expanded, and the storm looked a little more ragged than it did last night. Still a very intense tropical cyclone, and again about 100 miles from the mainland Florida. Still kind of lingering here overnight tonight. It will begin to pick up and travel to the northwest, and this great radar loop can be found at this URL here, courtesy of Mark Nissenbaum from Florida State University. A great resource to look at different radar loops. I couldn't get my words out. Look at different radar loops as the storm's approaching. That's the most accurate way to look at these tropical cyclones, when the radar loops are there. One silver lining I wanted to point out: a lot of people were worried about the rainfall from this storm, and again, I'm going to show a map in a second, kind of showing where the worst impacts are likely to be felt. But with Hurricane Floyd in 1999, with Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and with Hurricane Florence last year, we were pre-saturated here in North Carolina before those storms came. In the case of Floyd, Hurricane Dennis in 1999 had just come through and given eastern North Carolina a lot of rain, and then Floyd came through very slowly and dumped a lot of rain on top of that. The ground was already saturated. There was no threat of any kind of drought. The ground was just soaked, and then these storms came in and created a lot of inland flooding. With Matthew, again, we had a very wet stretch up to the beginning of Matthew in October of 2016. And with Florence last year, you may remember, we had one of the wettest years on record in Raleigh, and Wilmington shattered their all-time rainfall record for a given calendar year. So there was already a lot of water in the ground when those storms came through. For Dorian, that is not the case. All of these are stream gauges along rivers in North Carolina, and there's only a few that are currently being listed as, susceptible in the coming days for something. We haven't really had a lot of rain. It's been a kind of a on and off summer where we've had periods of a lot of rain and periods of dry and hot weather, so not really a huge concern with inland flooding with this. It's going to be moving so quick that there's definitely going to be some isolated flooding and some flash flooding, urban flooding on roads and parking lots, flood-prone areas. But we're not looking at a statewide flooding disaster like with Florence, where you have, several hundred square miles of, just inundation and flooding in urban areas from rivers and freshwater flooding. Doesn't look to be the case with this. The grounds are really just not saturated. We haven't had much rain leading up to this, so that is good news from Dorian. This is from the Flood Inundation Mapping and Alert Network. FIMAN is created by North Carolina Emergency Management, a very great resource to use. Fortunately, we shouldn't have to use it much because that flooding should be kept to a minimum. Thanks to everyone who is tuning in. Nicole says UNCW has canceled class for the remainder of the week. So I think you're just echoing the statement there. So UNCW is taking precautions. And I know Ocracoke Island has issued a mandatory evacuation as well for its residents. I think there's a couple hundred residents or several hundred residents that live on Ocracoke that will have to evacuate. So preparations are underway. But in terms of the actual impacts, which most of you are probably waiting for, the earliest reasonable arrival time of tropical storm force winds, which is a sustained winds of 39 to 73 miles per hour. Sustained winds, of course, meaning that's, a constant average of wind over 60 seconds or a minute. So this is not, just wind gusts up to 39. That's when the trees are kind of constantly swaying. The winds kind of start to whistle a little bit when you get up to, 50 or 60 mile per hour sustained winds. And it gets kind of eerie outside. You hear the whistling when the winds get that high. But in regard to the earliest reasonable arrival time of these winds in North Carolina, you can see that is going to come on late Wednesday and last through Thursday and into Friday. So this is the earliest reasonable arrival. This tends to be a pretty accurate representation that the Hurricane Center puts out of when, winds can really start to pick up. So in essence, what this graphic means is complete all your preparations. If you have loose lawn furniture, if you have pets outside, if you have, if you need to board up windows, if you live closer to the coast, if you need to do whatever, have that done by Wednesday p.m., so Wednesday afternoon, because those winds will start to move in and create, make preparations much more difficult and, of course, much more dangerous. If winds are gusting up to 50 or 60 miles per hour and you're outside, a tree could fall. We see trees fall all the time with severe thunderstorms. This would be like having, a thunderstorm kind of constantly ongoing for several hours, and this is just the onset of the winds, and they will last until the storm moves on. So we're looking at a period of perhaps 24 to 36 hours of tropical storm force winds along the coast here, and then gusts farther inland as well. I'm going to jump to a graphic in a second to kind of show that if you're in the Triad, if you're listening from the Triad area, if you're listening from the Charlotte area, even kind of Durham and Burlington and points west, or in the foothills of North Carolina, I really think your impacts are going to be limited from this. It'll be breezy on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and you may get some rain showers, but I don't think any kind of impactful weather is going to be heading your way. I don't think you're going to have to really change plans or anything. You're just too far inland for this particular storm. It will definitely be breezy, but I don't think you're going to see any prolonged impacts or power outages or anything like that in those areas. So moving on to the rainfall forecast, this has been adjusted, This has been adjusted with the latest update of Dorian, with this orange color representing widespread 6 to 10 inches of rain, the yellow indicating 4 to 6, and then 2 to 4, and 1. So again, if you see, you're in the Triad over in this area, and in Charlotte, down in this area, Charlotte Metro, the foothills, you're well outside of this. But there's a very tight gradient here because as Dorian is, moving up the coastline here, we're going to see a very tight gradient from from northwest to southeast as the storm goes. But again, down here in Ocracoke, down here in Wilmington, still at risk. You can't see that red there, but this whole area in here still at risk for seeing some tremendous rainfall amounts in a short amount of time. Again, I'll reiterate that one of the silver linings to this forecast is that Dorian will be scooting right along, probably at a pretty good clip when it does come here. So it's not going to be raining for a tremendously long amount of time, but the rain that does fall will be heavy. It will be accompanied with potentially hurricane force wind gusts up on the coast here and tropical storm force wind gusts up here, resulting in some widespread power outages. So that's what the current rainfall forecast looks like. A very tight gradient. The closer to the coast you are, the more rain you're going to see. That kind of follows logic if you're thinking of a tropical cyclone. It's not going to come inland. With Florence, we had it coming inland. So let's see here if I can get a color that's going to work here. So with Florence, it had a track where it came inland, then snuck into South Carolina, and then curved back out up the Appalachian Mountains. So Florence lingered for several days here, and that is not going to be the case at all. That is not what's going on. Dorian is going to be coming from the coast and moving out this way. So instead of slamming into the coast perpendicular to the North Carolina coastline, this storm is going to be parallel to the coastline, and it may make a North Carolina landfall somewhere along the coast or the Outer Banks in the tidewater area out here, but it does not look like there's going to be any prolonged impacts from the storm coming inland. Again, I showed you this earlier, so I'm going to skip over that slide. This was a helpful slides package that was put together from the National Weather Service in Raleigh, which is looks over all of central North Carolina from just east of Charlotte to Interstate 95 or so. And that's kind of how I want to break this down as a general rule of thumb. Going forward, I'm going to refer to the areas based on between interstates, because I think that's a pretty good indication of what we're looking at here. So this is from the Weather Service in Raleigh, and they're saying, situation overview. There are potential for tropical storm strength wind gusts, which could blow over trees, mainly east of the US 1 highway corridor and eastward. So if you live, in areas like Sanford, Pinehurst, down into Rockingham, up through Raleigh and up through, Oxford and areas east, you're more at risk of seeing those tropical storm force wind gusts and sustained winds. And the highest winds would be Thursday afternoon and evening. In terms of rainfall amounts of 2 to 6 inches, could result in localized poor drainage and urban flooding. That's what I was referring to. It's going to be more of a flash flooding issue as opposed to, a large flooding disaster for the state. It does not look to be of that scale. With the highest rainfall amounts east of Interstate 95, I'll show you that in a second on a map. And then that would come Wednesday night through Friday morning. So again, with the onset of those tropical storm force winds, this would be late Wednesday, so September the 4th through September the 6th, and then that would be the primary time for any rain. There is a low risk of isolated tornadoes. Tornadoes can be embedded within the circulation of the storm. They're most commonly north and east of the center of circulation, so that will be kept offshore, but it cannot be ruled out that a couple of tornadoes are possible. A couple of tornado warnings are possible within the circulation as it moves off of the coast of North Carolina. Again, the greatest risk of that east of Interstate 95. So to show you that, I pulled up this graphic here, kind of how I'm breaking it down, just as a general rule of thumb. The Weather Service does a very similar graphic here. I've just broken it down by interstate. So the main thing here, it looks like I can't do what I wanted to here, so that's unfortunate. But in this area that's not shaded out here, I really think your impacts are going to be limited. So from the Triad and points west, from the Charlotte metro area and points west, you're probably going to see some breezy conditions on Thursday. You'll notice the winds pick up, maybe some isolated showers, potential thunderstorm, but nothing that's going to really, impact your day or really change your plans. In this orange zone, you're kind of in the battleground zone for the further east you go, your conditions are going to worsen. You could still see tropical storm force wind gusts, so that's 39 mile per hour and upward. Scattered power outages are possible. Don't think it's going to be a widespread power outage situation, but you definitely live in an area here that's going to be have some rainfall and some breezy conditions, especially on Thursday. Thursday is going to be the nastiest weather day for this state, no matter where you live. And then if you're in this red region east of Interstate 95, so this is Interstate 85, I failed to mention. I kind of traced that along this general area, and 85 actually snakes out this way, but I just kind of continue this line going up toward that northeastward direction. And then if you're east of Interstate 95 here, in the red shading in the coastal plain of the state, you're at the highest risk for tropical storm force sustained winds, gust up to hurricane strength, and more torrential rainfall with higher totals possible, especially as you get closer to the coast down in Wilmington, Emerald Isle down here, down in Ocracoke, which is under the mandatory evacuation beginning on Wednesday, through the Outer Banks. So definitely a coastal plain event in terms of the worst impacts, but your widespread power outages are likely to be down in southeastern North Carolina, in the Inner Banks here, and the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula in this area as well. But again, so the red's going to have the worst impacts, orange is going to have intermediate impacts, and then if you live west of Interstate 85, I really think your impacts are going to be limited from Dorian. So I'm going to start to wrap up here, and I'm going to skip over that page for now. I would highly recommend you download the Ready NC app on your phone, smartphone, or mobile device if possible. I think it's a very useful tool to have. It's not limited to just hurricanes. Anytime there's any kind of significant weather or significant event happening in the state. So, if there's a lot of travel, like around the holidays or Thanksgiving or December or Christmas time or things like that, they update these regularly to see if there's any major things that are going to impact a lot of people. It updates all the time. It gives you current weather conditions, traffic conditions, power outages. It lets you know about evacuations and all kinds of good stuff. If Dorian ends up being, a storm that doesn't have as many impacts as forecast, you at least have a really cool app on your phone that you can resort to for any future significant impact events regarding weather in North Carolina. So I would highly recommend you download that. It's just Ready NC. You can search that on the App Store or Google Play or whatever means you use to do that. But that's where I kind of wanted to end up. It looks like our viewership has begun to dwindle, especially with, I think, most of the viewers in North Carolina kind of heard what they wanted and signed off. I know there's quite a contingency from Florida watching that have joined the past few days, so thanks for tuning in for that. Again, we're just kind of waiting and seeing when Dorian begins to take this northward turn. It's kind of sinking to the south in these later frames, so we'll see where the storm goes and how it progresses, and that will let us see the North Carolina impacts become more clearly. And I said that poorly. I meant to say, as the storm continues to move to the north, we will see the impacts become more clear, and we'll be able to more clearly understand what impacts we could receive from Dorian. And when that becomes available, I'll pass that along. I will share a lot of information from the National Hurricane Center and North Carolina Emergency Management, and will continue to be a feed for that information. And Erica says, "Oh no, I'm late. What did I miss? My phone died." Not much. I was just talking about, in summary, that actually is a great way to end the video. Just as a summary here, Erica, I talked about how Dorian has just sat over the northwestern Bahamas for about a day now, for about 24 hours. Tremendous impacts for the people living on Abaco Islands and the Grand Bahama, right here, Grand Bahama Island. Dorian is currently sitting about 100 miles off of the coast of mainland Florida, and there's still hurricane warnings posted for these areas as as Dorian begins to work northwestward, and hurricane force winds could begin to come on shore within the early morning hours and into tomorrow afternoon. It will begin to trace the southeastern coastline and move up, and then up into North Carolina at least. These tropical storm force winds will begin to fill in by Wednesday afternoon. So Wednesday afternoon, have all your preparations completed. If you live east or if you live west of Interstate 85, I really think your impacts will be limited from the storm. You'll have breezy winds, maybe a few isolated rain showers, maybe totaling up to 1 inch or 2. Not a major event for those folks. If you live east of Interstate 95, I think you're going to have the most impacts from Dorian as it glances the east coast of North Carolina. And if you live in between those, so if you live in central North Carolina, I think there's going to be a very tight gradient. Some people are going to get more than expected, some will get less than expected, and some will just kind of get exactly what was expected, but in the middle. Sanford, to be specific. Okay, so you're kind of in that battleground zone, so I kind of drew this map So Sanford down here near US 1, you're probably going to have a prolonged period of tropical storm force winds beginning Wednesday night, lasting into early Friday morning. So Thursday is going to be the worst weather day for the state. Probably anywhere from 2 to 4 inches of rain with locally higher amounts possible. Scattered power outages are likely, but altogether, pretty much looks like to be a coastal plain North Carolina event, and we will see what happens with Dorian. If you have any questions, feel free to message me on Facebook, or you can tweet me on Twitter at AndrewWXCenter. I share more rapid fire updates on that. I know we're all kind of getting tired of Dorian and getting really frustrated with the storm, and it's just kind of sitting here, and we're going to wait for it to move up the southeast coast and get the heck out of here so we can move on and get on with our lives. But right now, we're dealing with a strong hurricane that continues to linger and will slowly begin to turn northward, and will start to impact North Carolina by Wednesday afternoon, and by get out of the area by early Friday morning before going out to sea. So that's all I have for tonight. I will be back on tomorrow sometime to discuss where Dorian is at and what it is doing at that time, and any developments that happen throughout the day tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. Remember to be safe. And Erica, I appreciate your kind words. Same with you, Kurt. And I thank y'all for tuning in. Stay safe and take care of one another. These storms can be very annoying, I know, and very frustrating. So be kind to one another, be safe, and I will see you on the next video.